Hello and welcome to Ron Hoon History. My grandson Mason, who is my consultant on my YouTube history channel, told me I should always start every video with the same greeting. So thank you to everybody who has subscribed. If you're not a subscriber yet, please do so. I love to travel and share stories with you, amazing stories that most people don't know when it comes to history. And man, have I got a story for you today. I just happened to be in my pretty little, let me show you right here. Go for a little walk. Hometown of Wenatchee, Washington, which is mostly famous for the title it gave to itself a long time ago, to 100 years ago. This is kind of a cool little downtown. The apple capital of the world, that's what Wenatchee's known for, which is great. A lot of apples come out of here. But there's another story that people don't know that also comes out of Wenatchee that you will know just from watching this over the next few minutes. So everybody knows that it was Charles Lindbergh, the first flight across the Atlantic. And yeah, that was quite an accomplishment. And after leaving the East Coast and flying across the Atlantic and landing to great acclaim there in France, it's a story that's known around the world, and it's in all the history books. However, what if somebody asked you this question? Who was the first person to fly across the Pacific Ocean? Shouldn't that be something that's talked about as well? I mean, it's a lot farther, a lot longer of a flight, and it's a story that has its ending right here in this town, in Wenatchee, Washington, which is, like I say, it's my hometown. Went to school here in elementary school, 6th grade, Wenatchee High School, and loved growing up here. But there's a story that you learn here that just isn't known around the rest of the country or around the rest of the world, and it has to do with a man who I believe grew up here in eastern Washington, a fellow by the name of Clyde Pangborn. Really interesting guy. He was one of the earliest flight instructors for military pilots. This goes all the way back to World War I. There was not a lot of flying going on back then, but he knew enough about it that he trained some of our earliest pilots. So afterwards, after the war is over, he starts barnstorming. People are fascinated by flight, but they very rarely would ever see an airplane in the skies. So, you know, these guys who were great experts at flight would come fly into town, and people could watch that plane and maybe do a few aerial stunts and even take people up for rides. So that's how he was making his living, this guy named Clyde Pangborn. Well, he meets up with a guy named Hugh Herndon, who isn't really any kind of an aviation expert, but he's got a lot of money. Hugh Herndon's mom was the heiress to the Chevron oil fortune. That's going to play an important role in this story. So toward the end of the 1920s, 1929 to be exact, the Great Depression hits, and everybody's out of work. And so the business kind of dries up for Pangborn, this barnstorming that he was doing around the country. And he and Hugh Herndon start kind of brainstorming. Well, what else could we do? They come up with this idea to actually fly a plane around the world. They wanted to do that and create great headlines and be world famous. But somewhere over Siberia, they ran into trouble and basically had to kind of put down there and had to come up with a new plan. So here they are in Siberia. Now, what are you going to do in Siberia? It's not like they have a lot of airports to land in. But they did hear that in Japan, you know, they're already there kind of in the eastern part of Russia. They heard that, hey, somebody's offering $25,000 prize for the first person to fly across the Pacific Ocean. And they said, let's go for it. So Herndon had already asked his mom for, when money was very tight, the funding they would need to fly around the world. So they put that to the effort they would need to fly across the Pacific Ocean. Well, when they landed in Japan, getting ready to try to go off on this great adventure, Don't exactly know why. Maybe because he was a patriotic American. Hugh Herndon pulls out his movie camera and starts taking pictures of some of the Japanese military installations. And when they've landed in Japan, and the authorities kind of catch up with them, and they realize that he's been taking these pictures, and where did you fly in from, and how did you Americans get here? So they end up in jail. They throw him in jail. And eventually, I don't know how, but eventually they ended up actually being released from jail under the condition that they just move on, that they fly out of Japan. And they're like, yeah, that's our plan. We do. We want to fly from here over to the United States. No one's ever done it before. So October 4th, 1931, they're all set to go and to fly on this, what would seem very foolish, unproven, and incredibly dangerous flight across the Pacific Ocean. Now look, the flight across the Atlantic was going to be, or it had been, about 3,500 miles. This was going to be 2,000 miles more, 5,500 miles. So they loaded up. They had so much fuel, of course they needed it, but it would weigh the plane down. So they did all the calculations. They actually figured they were going to have to drop the landing gear, which wouldn't make for a very smooth landing if they even made it across to the USA. But they had to reduce the weight of the plane enough to make sure it would stay airborne across the ocean. Well, everything went for the most part okay, except that Herndon's job, one of his jobs, was to keep the fuel going on the aircraft. And they had a couple of different fuel tanks. They had the main fuel tank, but they also had one that was apparently out on the wings. I don't know if it was excess fuel storage or if it was for a fuel line, or exactly what it was, but he forgot to fill that up, and it was enough that the engine quit on them out there somewhere over those very cold Pacific Ocean waters. So Pangborn, who's the aviation expert, he's like, well, it's not like we got a big starter switch. I think that was back in the day when you cranked the propeller to get the engine going. So he's like, what are we going to do? The engine has stopped, and we don't want to crash into the ocean waters here. They'll never find us. So he basically nosedives it, brings it down from their cruising altitude to a little above 1,000 feet. I think it was about 1,400 feet above sea level. And that was enough, that steep descent, to get the propeller moving again and to get the engine going again, and they're back at it. Now the problem is, and this is where it gets really kind of interesting. Let me just stand here and show you right up here. This is kind of cool. Here we are in downtown Wenatchee, and those hills that are just off in the distance are the foothills of the Cascade Mountains. Now, I grew up looking at those foothills every day. There's some great hikes up into those mountains. But the Cascade Mountains are out there. Well, everything was going great until they got close to Seattle, which was where they were going to land, and it was all fogged in. Not a shocker if you have ever flown into Seattle outside of the beautiful summer months. The weather can really turn on you, cloudy, rainy, foggy, etc. So they had to come over the Cascade Mountains. And eventually they landed here in Wenatchee. Now, this is another cool part of the story. Let me take you right over here. Actually landed right up into those hills. And in fact, there's a marker in a residential neighborhood that kind of marks the spot where it happened. But basically there's a huge plateau right on top. Then there's a secondary plateau kind of right there in the shaded area. And that's where they landed, and it is commemorated with a marker. It's also connected here in Wenatchee. The airport is called the Pangborn. Well, at least when I lived here, it was called the Pangborn Municipal Airport. Who knows? Maybe it's the Pangborn International Airport now. But just a small airport and just a few gates. Anyway, they made it. And the cool part about it is, guess who was waiting for them when they finally arrived here on this great historic day? That a flight that, by the way, how long is it now? You know, you fly in comfort, you've got a restroom, they're going to bring you food, that kind of a thing. If you fly over the Pacific from here, I think it would be about 13 hours. This flight took 41 hours 13 minutes. Man, you would be cold. I'm sure they brought some food with them, but probably not a lot. And you'd be cold, you'd be hungry, or maybe even hangry, but they made it. And waiting for them was Clyde Pangborn's mom and Clyde's brother and one newspaper reporter from a newspaper in Japan. And that was the entire extent of the greeting party for this great historic event. And it ended right here in my old hometown of Wenatchee, Washington. I feel like it's a story that everybody should know, and most people don't, but now you can ask the question if it ever comes up. Okay, we all know who was the first to fly across the Atlantic. But now you know who the first two were to fly successfully across the Pacific. Thanks for watching. Be sure to tell your friends about Ron Hoon History right here on YouTube.